What's going on, Hokie Nation? Welcome into this edition of the Friday Q&A. I'm Kyle Marshak with lead analyst and columnist Chris Coleman on set. Nick Brown pressing the buttons behind the scenes. And Chris, it's basketball time, so let's go answer some questions.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, we're going to start big picture. Gretna Hokie asked, what are your expectations for men's and women's basketball this season? So just starting from the macro.
Yeah, that's a good question because I don't necessarily know what my expectations are. I know Megan Duffy has been a good coach, but there are just so few returning proven players from last year's team, and they're changing offensive systems too. They're going to be up tempo. I would expect them to be a better team in February than they are in November because there are going to be some growing pains and things like that. We'll expand on this probably next week when David Cunningham gets back and he's our women's basketball expert. But for them, I probably thinking like WNIT is the goal.
Gotcha.
I think it would be unfair. Like when your leading returning scorer, Matilda Eck, she's a very good shooter, but she'd have some games where she'd go off for 17 or 20, but she also had a streak of like 2 or 3 games in a row where she didn't score.
Yeah.
So where's the consistent scoring going to come from? And I think that's a question mark for them. As far as the men's team goes, it's a bunch of unknowns. It's just you've got a proven transfer portal point guard, Malijah Petit, can do the job. It's just so many different types of pieces in there. I think the balance of the team is better, whereas last year almost everybody they put out there was sort of an offensive focused player. With just 1 or 2 exceptions. I do think there's better balance in terms of defense and rebounding this year. So I think I think the balance is going to be better, but I don't think they're going to be quite as good offensively. Now, that might be a good thing because I think the last couple of years they were certainly good enough offensively to make the NCAA tournament, but they weren't good enough defensively or on the board. So I would be willing to take a slight step back offensively to get better at those other 2 things. Like Mike Young's first NCAA tournament team at Virginia Tech, they were only in the 50s in terms of offensive efficiency, but they were also in the 50s in defensive efficiency. So 2 years ago, we saw the team be outside the top 100 in defensive efficiency. Then they jumped up this past year in the 80s, but 80 still isn't quite good enough. I want to see them get up in that top 60 range in defensive efficiency. I think they're a team that will probably be picked like 12th or 13th in the conference or something like that, but I do think they'll finish better than whatever they're picked. Because I think Mike Young has the ability as a coach to kind of get the most out of his players from an offensive standpoint. I remember going back to his very first year at Virginia Tech. He had a 6'5" center. He had a point guard that couldn't shoot and a bunch of freshmen. And like everybody's like, dead last. Well, they went 16-16. He got more out of that team than he probably should have. Chemistry was an issue last year, and that's the big thing. That's the unknown. When you put together so many new faces, a few returning players, but with a bunch of transfers and a couple of freshmen also, how's the chemistry going to be? That'll eventually tell the tale of this year's men's basketball team, I think. It's one of those things, if things don't gel right, I could see a pretty low finish in the ACC. But if they gel properly, then I could see this team greatly exceeding expectations. But I think in basketball these days, with only 13 scholarship players and so much turnover on almost every roster, you can say that for any team,
right?
And the same applies for football. Some years you get the transfer portal right, some years you don't. Like Florida State, they can go from being a national title contender to the worst team in the ACC in one offseason because they didn't get their portal additions right, and that's why I think it's probably going to be a little harder for teams, not just Virginia Tech, to be consistent in this modern age of college athletics because you've got so much turnover on your roster.
Yeah, a lot of turnover. So no official media polls. They come out next week. We've got guys down in Charlotte right now voting for that stuff. But CBS Sports has released their men's basketball ACC projections. They have Virginia Tech at 15th in the conference. Does that seem fair?
I mean, consider it's about, I would, 12th to 15th probably is where I would have expected them to get voted in, just simply because you just don't know. There's so many new players. I mean, I'm sitting here looking at our projected lineup, and you see a number of guys in here who, Hyseer Miller is been a good player, but how is he going to adjust to a new system? Same thing for Ben Burnham. Lwal from VCU, how's he going to adjust to a new system? Is he going to progress offensively? I think Jaden Young has a lot of potential, but is he ready to take that step this year? I think it's a fair prediction, but I also think they'll finish higher than whatever they end up getting predicted.
Okay. Well, that was the next question that VT Train Man wanted to know. Projected men's basketball starting lineup, and then a follow-up to that. I saw in your article the question mark at the center/power forward position too. So let's dig into that.
Yeah, let's do that. Hysier Miller, point guard, 2-year starter at Temple. I expect will be their starter. I don't think he'll be the dynamic scorer of Sean Padula, but I think he'll be a better defender. A stronger on ball defender and things like that. I've got Jaden Shute starting on the wing, the transfer from Duke, along with Jaden Young, the returning player. Young I give the nod to because he's got experience, a 1-year experience in the system, so he knows how things work and everything like that. Ben Burnham, transfer from College of Charleston. He's a guy who's a very good fit for the system, can step out and shoot the 3-pointer and score in the paint. So, I think it kind of goes without saying that he's going to start at the 4. And I got Malijal Petit. He's been in the system for 2 years as well and is a very good back-to-the-basket scorer. He's going to play more minutes this year because he's dropped about 20 pounds. And, there's even been a couple of highlights they've put on social media of him making 3-pointers. So if he can expand that part of his game, he doesn't have to make a ton of them, just one every now and then I think that could, expand the Tech offense because opponents will have to defend them slightly differently. The rotation at the 4 and 5 is going to be probably the most interesting thing this year for me to watch. Can you play Lwal and Petit together? Because neither one of them has really proven. Neither one of them's like a great passer or a great shooter, and you don't want two one-dimensional players on the court together. So for me, you could probably play like Lwal with Wessler because Wessler can shoot it. You could play Petit with Burnham because Burnham can shoot it. On the other hand, if you're trying to close out a game and maybe you want your best defensive lineup out there for the last 2 minutes, then maybe it is Lwal and Petit. When I was just looking at the center position, you've also got Ryan Jones, who's a highly touted true freshman, and he's maybe probably the most physically talented of the centers, and he can shoot the ball as well, but he's only a true freshman. He's very, very young. What power forward can you pair him with? Maybe your best offensive/shooting lineup is Jones and Burnham. That's probably your biggest offensive threat, but it might actually be your weakest defensive lineup. So there's a lot of mixing and matching with the power forward and center positions for Virginia Tech this year. How do you get the combinations right? What are your best combinations against certain opponents and in certain situations, and which guys learn to coexist together? I think that's the challenge for Mike Young, is figuring out that rotation in the front court this year.
A lot of mixing and matching. Jones, highly touted at his position, top 100. And what does Lwal bring specifically?
He's a freak athlete. Mike Young said he's the best athlete he's ever coached. You can compare him to a certain extent to Deron Washington. He's a little bit thicker than Deron, weighs a little bit more. He could play the 4 and the 5. He's a guy who can play. If you want to go with a smaller lineup, you could play him at the 5 with a guy like Burnham at the 4. That's a possibility. He's a guy who didn't start playing basketball until he was 16. He grew up in London, so he's still pretty raw. He did make some strides to his offensive game this past year, but he's still got plenty of room for growth. He told me during media day that he was enjoying playing in the VT scheme because it slows things down for him. It runs at a slower pace than what they were doing at VCU, and it really gives him time to think about things a little more and process things in his head. So we'll see. We'll see if he can add to his range, and we'll see what he can do back to the basket. He's primarily just been a dunker and a putback guy so far in his career, but his block shot percentage, his offensive rebound percentage at VCU were amongst the best in the country. He's a guy, Tech fans have wanted a little more athleticism in this team for a couple of years now. He brings it. This guy's a top-notch, elite college basketball athlete, and he's going to help the Hokies on the boards and just overall raise their athletic profile.
Yeah. So we've got the athleticism on men's basketball. It's just about how they mesh together. Same can be said for women's.
Yeah, I think the men's team is more athletic than they were last year, and they should be better on the boards defensively. Yeah, I agree. how quickly do these guys pick up the offense? How quickly does Young figure out his rotation? He told us he was at 10 to 11 guys, and if they had to play a game right now, normally he's 8 to 9 man rotation. So I would expect by ACC play, maybe one guy gets dropped from the rotation and it gets a little more compact. The women's team is just going to be a lot of youth. I think there's talent in there. I think David Cunningham in his article yesterday wrote that there's a total of 6 top 100 players in the program. I think when it comes to women's basketball recruiting analysis, sometimes I don't think there's not as much money to be made in women's basketball, so I don't think there's quite as many necessarily talented scouts who do rankings and things like that. Yeah. So you have to take women's basketball rankings with a grain of salt to a certain extent. But there's enough talent in there where they can put a competitive product on the court for sure. Yeah,
when I was looking at other media polls, projections, CBS, Sports Illustrated, they had everything on men's basketball. ACC projections could not find anything on women's basketball. So let's end with this: just a ceiling and a basement for each team.
It sounds odd to say. It sounds odd to say. I mean, I do think both teams could conceivably, under the right set of circumstances, make the NCAA tournament. I think under the wrong set of circumstances, you lose the wrong player to injury. They don't mesh well enough. The results could be pretty bad for either team. It's just one of those things where these days you got 13 scholarship players for men. Technically, you got 15 for women, but women's team, hardly any women's teams fills those 13 spots these days. You're over half your roster changes on a year-to-year basis, which makes it incredibly hard to predict. And that's the same for everybody else. So when I sit here and say, Virginia Tech could be better, they could be worse or whatever, that's me not knowing what other teams are going to do as well. Because, NC State's got transfers in. They've got a couple Louisville guys. And are those guys talented players because they played on a really bad Louisville team, right? Was it because they're bad, or was it because they were poorly coached? Or there chemistry issues that they're going to take from Louisville to NC State that's going to hurt NC State? I mean, there's just so many unknowns. I could see either team in the NCAA tournament. I don't think it's likely, but I could see it happen. But I also could see both teams being pretty bad. But I don't think that's likely either. The truth is probably somewhere in between.
That's the turnover for you. All right, well, good basketball talk. What are your plans for this bye week?
Bye week, I'm going home to Danville this weekend.
Nice.
Believe it or not, taking a little mini break.
Sweet. All right, well, I think that about wraps things up here at the Tech Sideline Studios. Thank you guys for your suggestions as always. Be sure to check out the actual Friday Q&A article on techsideline.com. That's live every Friday morning. But for our producer, Nick Brown, our lead analyst and columnist, Chris Coleman, I'm Kyle Marshak. We'll see you next Friday.